We're here at Hauser Wirth London to talk to Anj Smith about her new show, Phosphor on the Palms. You've been working on this series of paintings that form this show at Hauser Wirth for the past 3 years.
Yeah.
And there are 21 paintings, so it's your largest ever show.
Yep.
Can you tell us a bit about the concept maybe behind the show and the series and how it's developed over that time frame?
Yes, well, all the works are very different actually, and there's references to a myriad of different sources, so zoology and psychological states, the way that language operates. Lots and lots of different source material inspires me. So the one thing that is constant throughout all these different areas of interest is this idea of liminality, where things are in a state of flux and there's a sort of instability at the heart of everything. That's why I chose to title the show the way I did, with the Wallace Stevens poem, which is called Fablio of Florida. I've chosen the central, or for me, the central image of the poem, which is the idea of a Florida beach where there's an overcast sky which is almost indistinguishable to make out from the surf and from the sand. So there's this sort of idea of liminality in the poem. And it's quite a cyclical poem, and the poem is punctuated to read as though there are waves breaking on the beach. And at the heart of this poem, there is a sort of slick of oil caught up in the palm fronds. And along with the ambiguous nature of the poem and the fact that things are slippery and thresholds are not defined, is this idea that the poet has taken the rainbow that used to be the preserve of the romantics in nature, and he's sort of debased that and relocated it just to these filthy palm fronds. So there's an idea that perhaps in our search for transcendence, we can look at the unlikely and the overlooked. So those two aspects of that poem really chimed with everything that I was working with in each of the paintings. So it felt like a good linchpin to tie everything together, really.
At what point did the title come?
Almost right at the end, actually. Yes, I gave myself a month, actually, to think of the title, because it needed to be right. And quite by chance, I was reading this book of poetry, and it just leapt out at me like a thunderbolt. It was just the perfect image for what I needed. It's a metaphor, really.
You've mentioned that there's quite a lot of different themes and aspects that you bring into your paintings.
Yes.
So maybe if we look at the one that we're standing by now,
Sure.
If you could maybe pull some of those out, talk us through some of the aspects.
Yes, well, my work is very much a celebration of painting. Painting has obviously been decried as being dead for 150 years. So for me, it's a very loaded medium. And there's something very profound, I think, about painting now in 2015 with a medium that is heralded as being dead, and that's been so harumphed about. Because I think there's something really exquisite about using a medium which in its own right is a metaphor for something eternal that remains despite everything. And that's really apt with the subject matter that I'm dealing with. So that's also very much at the heart of this painting. But there's another aspect to the work, which is that the traditional genres of portraiture and still life and landscape are very much collapsed in keeping with the entire instability that I referred to earlier. So, for example, in this painting, I don't see this as a straightforward portrait. There are elements of self-portraiture, but not necessarily literally my physical face, as you can probably tell, but I suppose this figure is blonde. But apart from that, the self-portraiture is more abstract in the sense that it might be a reference to a state of mind or a psychology that I've experienced. So there's that. And then there's another layer to it, which is that it is also treating the figure as just part of the furniture of the painting in a sense. So the figure is almost a device on which to hang my conceptual concerns and my exploration of different social mores. And there's yet another layer, which is there is a very close friend of mine who has had a sex change. And he has become someone who is very inspirational for me. For a while, he was neither male nor female physically, and it's prompted me to really consider our identity post or beyond gender, if that's even possible. And I've always made work, I've always identified as a feminist, since I was a small child and people explained inequality to me. But after this experience of seeing this up close, reading around gender and feminism, it stopped becoming theoretical for me and it became personal. And so a lot of the work references what happened to my close friend. And in turn, that opens out into a metaphor to address the structures that make up or contribute to who we feel we are and what happens when we take those away. And if there is anything essential that remains, what is that? So that's very much just a very brief, well, that is a very complex work. They're all really complex, but that's a very brief introduction to what this work's about.
Yeah, I mean, they are completely complex, and the more you look, the more you see. And you've got a lot of sort of, I don't know if you'd call them motifs, but the flower, the cigarette butt, the green stone there, do they all have specific meanings?
Well, I tend to think of the figure as having created an armour or a display to wear as clothing from the landscape which he or she inhabits. So just out of the detritus of what he happens to be standing in, which is why the cigarette end is treated in the same way as the flower, or as the amazing Van Cleef jewellery that's been broken up and reassembled. I love the tradition of Dutch still life painting. The vanitas paintings I find very, very beautiful, although I think it's really important to point out that I'm not trying to emulate any kind of art historical painting. In fact, I'm actually doing the opposite. They're sort of antithetical to that in a sense, because with art historical paintings such as the vanitas that we're chatting about, there was a real code, so the viewer would understand that a skull meant mortality or something perhaps, but we don't really understand symbolism like that anymore. That's it's almost like a dead language. So for me, what I find really interesting working now is that you can delve back into the rich history of painting, but you're freed up from the sort of sense of what happened after that period of history with the avant-garde, prescriptivism. We're freed up completely from that, and we can pick and choose from the rich mine that painting's history in particular affords us. And we can employ that for our own ends as contemporary artists. So, for example, when I look at the Dutch, I love the idea that Willem Kalf came out with, which is, he was talking about the rivalry that you have between something like a Ming vase that is the pinnacle of human accomplishment, an exquisite object, and the representation of that. So if you can paint something, which is what his intention was, if you could paint the Ming vase and make that even more exquisite than the original object, then somehow painting has rendered this masterpiece redundant. I find that really exciting ambition for painting. So I take inspiration from art history, and I think it's really important if you're working now to understand the context, the great canon. I think it's really important that you're cognizant of where you come. But at the same time, I do see painting now as contemporary conceptual art, and I feel that we need to take responsibility for what we reference. I don't feel that it's just a vague mishmash, free-for-all. I think that it's important for an artist to make work that is of their time and that makes sense socially. Otherwise, it just is quite self-indulgent and masturbatory. And there's a lot of work, well, perhaps not a lot, but there is some work around that is of that ilk, which I don't enjoy personally. And again, I think it's important that it makes sense in its historical context. It's quite important for me. Everything here is fractured, but again, it is being reconfigured into a new tableau. So it isn't stable, it's in a process of flux, as with everything in this show. And again, things are not always exactly what they seem. So these orchids here, actually there's two different kinds, but they are bird orchids. You can see there's a bird in the stamen here. There's sometimes these works operate like a Fabergé egg, so you'll look at something and then there are layers of meaning and details that will emerge from close inspection.
Such as also the little skulls at
yes.
the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a moth here. death's head moth that you'll only see if you're really looking at the work. So it's almost like a reward system for people that, that look properly at the work. A different painting will emerge on close proximity. I do like the idea that you'll experience different paintings from one work depending on your viewpoint.
They're absolutely paintings that you have to come and see in the flesh. You don't get it at all from JPEGs or reproductions.
No.
How long does it take you to make a painting like this?
Actually, it does really depend, but some of the works in this show have taken 3 years. Some have taken a couple of months, but the germination for those ideas have been long coming. So this painting probably took about 1.5 years, although I was working on other works at the same time. I always work in series. The detail I paint with brushes that I send off for that have almost just got one hair on them. So that's part of the reason why they take so long. But another reason, which people I don't think automatically are aware of, is it's actually this density of colour that takes so long to produce, because it's just very sheer layer of red upon very sheer layer of red. And there's no real shortcuts for doing that. To get that kind of luminosity, you just have to put the hours in.
And you have to let it dry, presumably,
exactly,
in between.
Exactly.
So how many layers would, for example, this one have on it?
50.
Wow.
I love the idea as well when I'm painting skin, particularly with the veins underneath several layers of paint down. So there's probably more layers of paint, or as many layers of paint as we have layers of skin. I just enjoy that idea while I'm painting.
That links in with the idea of identity as well, and sort of different
being so
layers.
Being so layered,
yeah.
Absolutely, and being so labyrinthine.
Do you know before you start out what the finished painting is going to look like? I mean, do you make a sketch?
I don't make a sketch because I enjoy the awkwardness and the immediacy of not having psychologically prepared exactly what the work's going to look like. However, I do have a conceptual framework for the piece that I'm sold on before I start work. But paint, as we know, has its own autonomy and it decides what it wants to do. So often the image that I end up with is not exactly what I could have foreseen, which I think is exciting.
And then, okay, we have to mention monkeys. There's a strange little blue creature there in the top left.
Yeah. There's a lot of monkeys in this show. I'm fascinated by all kinds of nature, but monkeys perhaps in particular, especially at the moment. I go in phases with my animal crushes, but I think the monkey for me is metaphorical, and it is so in a different way to each work. Sometimes it is to do with the fact that monkeys are us, really. We are monkeys, but at the same time, they are other. They're somehow on the cusp of both worlds, and that's why I find them really fascinating, because I think they're almost an emblem of both states. And of course, I see monkeys as a sign of origin. So there is that mystery that's shrouded around the monkey as well, which I find really fascinating and really inspiring. And all of the animals that you'll see in the show, there's nothing fantastical or surreal about any of the works. Everything you see is exactly how it exists in life.
The eyes, I mean, they're perhaps when I saw your work just online even, that was what stood out to me. And
oh, okay.
I actually find them quite, I don't know, sinister almost. that in so many of your paintings, the eyes have either got these big dark rings around them or some kind of an object across them.
You know, we all understand eyes to be the most loaded part of somebody's face, but I find this part of the face personally quite an erogenous zone. I'm always really attracted to the eye and the hollow. I find that there's something very compelling about that in somebody. But at the same time, I'm very much at pains to point out or to direct the viewer towards considering the interiority of the sitter. So that was almost a device in which to do that, to highlight the eyes. I mean, this series of work is very much more psychological and more to do with the inner world than previous works that I have done, previous bodies of work. One of my favourite paintings in the world is a Richard Dadd painting called The Fairy Feller's Masterstroke. And while he was constructing this painting, which took a decade to construct, it's amazing, but whilst he was making that, he made very detailed notes. And he called those notes the elimination of a picture. So this painting, actually there was a much longer title, but I just chose the first bit of his written notes to title this painting, and it is, in a sense, an homage to one of the greatest painters, I think, in the canon of painting. However, I hate using the term outsider art because I feel it's really pejorative, and I think everyone's sick of it now anyway, for the right reasons. But I feel sometimes drawn to art that is traditionally made from the margins. I think that I'm drawn to art that is not easily won. And another great influence is Adolf Wölfli, the Swiss artist. I think there's something about artists that are so caught up in their own personal vision that they're not bothered by what good taste is, and they're not particularly bothered about what art is. And I think there's a real authenticity that speaks from that kind of work. And I think it's probably about time that we widened what art history includes for that very reason.